Welcome back to the Global Ledger. I'm Justin. There are two phrases that dominate headlines every time the central bank acts. That is money printing and liquidity withdrawal. They sound really dramatic, but they also sound intuitive. But they're mostly wrong. Today's episode, I'd like to clear that up. Because quantitative easing and quantitative tightening are not about stimulus in the way most people imagine. They're not about flooding the economy with money or sucking it out, and they're definitely not about handing cash to households or businesses. They're about balance sheets. And if you don't understand whose balance sheet is changing, how it's changing, and what replaces what, you're going to misread almost everything that follows, from inflation debates to asset prices to market stress. So today, we're going to strip the emotion out of QE and QT and look at them for what they really are. Let's get into it. We're going to talk about what QE actually is, what it means, okay? And this is quantitative easing, QE for short. And here is kind of the cleanest definition, okay? QE is an asset swap. That is it, okay? QE is an asset swap. No helicopters, no printing presses, no bags, no bags of cash entering the economy, okay? This is an asset swap, okay? So when QE happens, the central bank buys securities, usually treasury bonds or agency mortgage-backed securities from the private sector. This is where people get confused. The central bank buys securities. Buys. Okay? Let's talk about how it pays, okay? Because this is, I think, where trips people up a little bit. They pay by crediting reserve balances, okay? They credit the bank's reserve account in which they hold at the Fed in exchange for treasury bonds or agency mortgage-backed securities. Okay, so after QE, the private sector holds more reserves. The private sector holds fewer long-duration securities. The total size of private sector net financial assets is unchanged. Something was exchanged, not created out of thin air. Okay, on one side of the system, a bond disappears. It's gone. Okay, so you're taking it out. On the other side, a reserve balance appears. Okay, that's not stimulus in the everyday sense. That's portfolio reconfiguration. Classical banking move, okay? That's a really important distinction. I cannot make this enough because this is where most people start to trip up. They start to trip up when they hear that the central bank is buying securities. And some of the things that are said and spread are that the central bank creates money out of thin air in order to buy that asset. Okay, it's not that. It's not that. They are swapping assets with existing assets. Okay, so just keep that in mind. Why does QE affect markets anyway with this type of mechanism? If QE is just an asset swap, then why does it matter? Because not all assets behave the same at all, even if they're both safe. Reserves are overnight, are perfectly liquid, do not fluctuate in price, sit inside the banking system. Long-term bonds, on the other hand, they have duration risk, move with interest rates, are used as collateral, anchor pricing across markets. So when QE replaces long bonds with reserves, it changes who holds risk, what can be pledged, and how portfolios are constructed. It compresses term premiums, it flattens volatility, and it changes relative pricing. And this isn't by force, but by removal of alternatives. Okay, so QE doesn't push people to take risk. It removes the safe assets that allowed them not to. Okay? So let me repeat that. QE doesn't push people to take risk. It removes the safe assets that allowed them not to take risk. Okay? That is QE. And at its simplest explanation that I can give, and I'm sure there are other people that can explain it a lot simpler and better than I can. I'd like to move on to QT though, and talk about that, what it is and what it isn't. This is another word that gets a little misunderstood. QT stands for quantitative tightening. QT sounds like the reverse of QE. And mechanically, it is. It kind of is. But again, the meaning people attach to it is usually wrong. QT happens when securities held by the central bank mature or are sold, and reserves are drained from the system in exchange. Okay, so QT happens when securities that are held by the central bank mature or they are sold, and reserves are drained from the system in exchange. Okay, so after QT, the private sector holds more bonds, the private sector holds fewer reserves, total net financial assets are still unchanged. Nothing was destroyed, nothing was confiscated. Okay, the composition just changed. And that distinction is critical. Okay, it's critical. QT is not liquidity withdrawal in the way you might think, okay? Here's a critical point that almost never gets discussed clearly. Very few people that I've seen discuss this clearly, okay? So QT does not remove money from the economy. It changes where liquidity sits and what form it takes. Okay, reserves are liquidity inside the banking system. Treasuries are liquidity inside markets. QT shifts liquidity out of banks and into tradable instruments. That can be destabilizing, not because money vanished, but because the plumbing changed. Banks have different constraints than markets. Markets rely on collateral chains. Dealers intermediate both sides of that. Okay, so QT stresses the system when dealers don't have balance sheet capacity anymore or collateral refuses to break. Collateral reuse breaks is what I mean by that. Funding markets also. QT stresses the system when funding markets can't absorb the shift smoothly. You know, that's not tight money in the textbook sense, okay? That's microstructure stress, okay? So really important parts of QT and QE. I want to tie in right now what gets really wrangled up. This is where the conversation often goes completely off the rails. QE did not cause inflation by printing money. QT does not fight inflation by destroying money. Inflation is about spending capacity, supply constraints, fiscal flows, labor markets, energy and commodity shocks, so on and so forth. We will do separate episodes on these really important topics. They're really popular. But QE changes financial conditions. QT changes financial conditions. Neither of those directly injects purchasing power into households. Neither directly removes it either. Okay, so balance sheet policy shapes the environment, not the transaction itself. Mistaking that will lead to bad analysis and worse policy debates. So important to try to make those distinctions between inflation and its relationship to QE and QT. The quiet truth about all this, though, is balance sheets are the real policy channel. This is why I think the Fed and the central banks have a very difficult job. The Fed today is about managing its balance sheet. Okay, so modern monetary policy doesn't work primarily through quantities of money. It works through relative prices, funding costs, risk premia, market functioning. QE and QT are tools for shaping those conditions. They're not levers that push inflation up or down on their own. They matter because the system is leveraged, it's collateralized, and it's extremely interconnected. They matter because who holds what matters. And they matter because balance sheets constrain behavior long before money supply shows up in a chart. Okay? I want to thank you for listening to episode 53 of the Global Ledger. Next time you hear the Fed is printing again, or the Fed is draining liquidity, just pause for a second and ask, which balance sheets are changing? What asset is being replaced? Who now holds the duration? Who now holds the reserves? Can the system intermediate the transition? If you ask those questions, you'll see what's actually happening, not just what sounds dramatic. Okay? In the next episode, episode 54, we're gonna hop to standing facilities, okay, and talk about this new architecture of stability. Really, really important topic. So stay tuned. I'm Justin, and thanks for being here.